I was standing near the far end of the reception hall when Thessaly asked the question that changed everything. The hall was on the upper deck of the Meridian Ring, a neutral platform that floated somewhere between 4 different star systems, owned by no one, and used by everyone. The ceiling was made of transparent panels, and beyond it the stars were thick and close, the way they always looked out here, away from the light pollution of any planet. Around me, delegates from 11 different species were talking, eating things I could not identify, and pretending to enjoy each other's company. The usual evening at a conclave reception. I had a glass of something pale and cool in my hand. I had barely touched it. I was watching the room the way I always watched rooms, which is to say I was listening to everything and making my face look relaxed. Thessaly appeared at my left shoulder without warning. She was a Valorian, which meant she was tall, feathered along the arms and collar, and possessed of the particular kind of confidence that comes from belonging to a species that had never lost a war in 400 years. She was also young, at least by Valorian standards, which meant she had not yet learned to hide what she was thinking. "Ambassador Morrow," she said, and her translator chip gave her voice a slightly musical quality that I had come to find pleasant. "I have been studying your people, quite thoroughly in fact." "That is very kind of you," I said. It was not kindness, it was professional curiosity. She tilted her head in that way Valorians do when they are about to say something they have been holding back. "Your people have been part of the conclave for 212 years. In that time, not a single fleet, not a single empire, not a single pirate faction or rogue colony, or splinter group, has made a serious military move against Earth or any human settlement. Not one." "I am aware of that," I said. "Your official military budget is smaller than that of the Ulari Merchant Guild. Your colonies are spread thin. Your publicly registered warships are old. By every metric I can find, your species should have been raided, colonized, or simply absorbed into a larger power decades ago." She paused. "And yet you have not been. So I would like to ask you, directly and plainly, why?" Wade the room. The room did not literally go quiet, but I noticed, in the way I notice things, that 3 delegates nearby had stopped their own conversations and were now very carefully not looking at us. I noticed the Kreth representative, a thick-shouldered creature named Vorath who was technically here as a cultural observer, shift slightly in the direction of our corner of the room. Everyone wanted to know the answer to that question. No one else had been willing to ask it. I looked at Thessaly for a moment. She held my gaze without blinking, which was remarkable, because Valorians blink often and rapidly. "That," I said, "is a very good question." Then I smiled and took a sip of my drink. She waited. I did not continue. After a moment, she made a small sound of frustration that her translator chip rendered as a soft chime. "You are not going to answer." "I am going to answer," I said, "just not right now." She studied me with those pale gold eyes. "When?" "When the answer becomes relevant," I said. I did not know, at that moment, that relevant was roughly 48 hours away. The conclave session the next morning was standard business. Border disputes between the Sorathi and the Chedrani. A trade agreement revision involving mineral rights in the outer lanes. I sat in the human delegation seat, which was toward the back of the chamber, because we had joined the conclave relatively recently, and seniority determined placement. I made notes. I voted on the minor items. I watched Vorath across the chamber and noted that he was not watching the trade agreement discussion at all. He was watching me. The Kreth were the largest military power in the conclave. They had held that position for roughly 3 centuries. They had earned it the way empires usually do, through a combination of superior technology, willingness to use it, and an institutional confidence that had, over time, begun to shade into something harder and less pleasant. They did not start wars. They did not need to. They made it clear that certain outcomes were non-negotiable, and other species adjusted their behavior accordingly. Every species except humans. Not because we had refused to adjust, because we had never been presented with a demand in the first place. Vorath had been watching us for years. I had read his intelligence reports, or what our people had been able to obtain of them. He was careful, methodical, and patient. He had been building a picture of humanity for a long time. He thought he was close to understanding us. I was fairly certain he was not. After the session, I walked to my quarters on the residential ring. My aide, a young man named Owen, fell into step beside me in the corridor. Owen was 26, from a city in the north of England, and he had the specific quality of a person who understood that most of his job was to be present and quiet at the right moments. "There is a communication flag on your terminal," he said. "From Earth Defense Coordination. Priority green." "Thank you, Owen." "Should I stay?" "No, thank you." He nodded and peeled off toward his own quarters. I went to mine, sat down, and read the flag. It was brief. A Kreth scout fleet, 7 vessels, had altered course in the outer lanes approximately 18 hours ago. The new heading was consistent with an approach to the Kepler-22 system, where humanity had its third-largest colonial settlement. 340,000 people, farmers mostly, some engineers, a university, 3 hospitals, good land and a mild sun. The fleet had not opened any communication channel. They had not filed an approach notice with the conclave, which was technically required. They were simply moving, steadily and without explanation, toward a place where human beings lived. I sat for a while, looking at the message. Then I sent one encrypted reply back to Earth Defense Coordination. 4 words. I want them contained. The response came back in 11 minutes. We see them. Good. I closed the terminal and went to find Thessaly. She was in the observation lounge on the upper ring, which was quiet at this hour, just 2 Sarathi delegates talking softly near the far window and the endless stars beyond the glass. I sat across from her without being invited and put my hands flat on the table. "I am ready," I said, "to begin answering your question." She looked at me with those steady eyes. "Something has happened." "Something is happening," I said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "The Kreth." I did not confirm it. I did not need to. She was sharp, and she had clearly been keeping her own eye on fleet movements. She unfolded her hands on the table and looked at them, and for just a moment, she looked less like a diplomat and more like something younger and more uncertain. "How much trouble is my species in?" she said carefully, "if this goes badly for you?" "The Valorian home system borders Kreth territory on 2 sides," I said. "So that is a reasonable thing to be thinking about." "Ambassador." "Thessaly." I leaned forward slightly. "I am going to tell you some things about my people, things that are not in any file you have read, and when I am finished, I think your level of concern about the next few days will be somewhat different than it is right now." She looked at me for a long, still moment. "All right," she said. The stars moved slowly past the observation window, and I began to talk. I told her about Earth, not the diplomatic version, not the summary that appeared in conclave intake documents. I told her what Earth was actually like, and what human history was actually like, and what it had made us. I told her that every other species in the conclave, when it reached a certain level of development, had gone through a unification event. Some were driven by the discovery of an external threat. Some were driven by a biological or cultural instinct toward collective harmony. Some simply reached a point where cooperation was so obviously more efficient than conflict that it happened more or less naturally. Humans did not unify. Not like that. We fractured, we rebuilt, we fractured again. We built nations and tore them down. We signed agreements and broke them. We invented things specifically designed to end each other more efficiently, and then used those things and then rebuilt and invented again. We dropped the most destructive weapons we had ever made on our own cities, and then did not collapse. We kept going. We rebuilt. Twice. Then we kept building. Thessaly was very still. "The thing that every species misunderstands about us," I said, "is that they look at our history and they see chaos. They see a species that nearly destroyed itself multiple times, and they conclude that we are dangerous in the way that a broken machine is dangerous, unpredictably, by accident. And that is wrong," she said. "That is incomplete," I said. "We are dangerous the way a person is dangerous when they have been in enough difficult situations that they have stopped being surprised by them. We are not reckless. We are not suicidal. We are simply not intimidated by the prospect of things being very bad, because things have been very bad before, and we are still here." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a service vessel drifted past the window, its running lights blinking in the dark. "You said there were things not in any file I had read," she said. "Yes." I paused. 40 years ago, approximately 40 years after first contact with the Conclave, the major governments of Earth reached a quiet agreement. Not a military treaty, not a defense pact, something simpler than either. "What kind of agreement?" "A signal system," I said, "and a decision about what to show and what not to show." She waited. "When we first made contact with the Conclave and began to understand how it worked," I said, "our governments did not panic. They looked at the way other species behaved when threatened. They showed their strength. They deployed their biggest ships to the border. They wanted the other side to understand what they were facing. And our governments looked at that, and looked at our own history, and made a different decision. They decided not to show anything," Thessaly said slowly. "They decided to let everyone assume they already understood us," I said. "There is a difference. A species that is hiding looks like it is hiding. A species that lets you believe you have seen everything looks exactly like a species you do not need to worry about. One of those is a strategy. The other is a way of life." Thessaly stared at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. "And the Kreth fleet is about to find out what happens when that assumption is tested," I said. She looked at me for a long time. The Sarathi delegates near the far window finished their conversation and left, and the room was suddenly very quiet. "You are not worried," she said. It was not quite a question. I considered my answer carefully. "I am attentive," I said. "There is a difference." She held my gaze, and I could see her recalculating, the way intelligent people do when a piece of information has quietly reorganized everything they thought they knew. She was not afraid of me. Exactly. But she was beginning to understand that she had been asking the wrong question all along. The right question was not why humans had never been attacked. The right question was what had always been quietly waiting for the moment that someone tried. As she opened her mouth to say something, my communicator chimed softly. I looked down at it. The Kreth fleet had just crossed the outer boundary marker of the Kepler-22 approach corridor. "Forgive me," I said, standing. "I have to make a call." I left her sitting at the table with the stars behind her, looking like a person who has just understood that the ground beneath them is considerably more solid than they realized, and also considerably deeper. The call took 30 seconds. I said 3 words, then I went to bed. In the morning, everything changed. The news reached the Meridian Ring before breakfast. I was in the small kitchen area of my quarters, making coffee the way I had made it every morning since I was 19 years old, when Owen knocked on the door and came in with an expression on his face that I had not seen on him before. "They stopped," he said. I poured the coffee. "Tell me." "The Kreth fleet. All 7 vessels. They crossed the outer boundary marker at 0340 station time, and then they stopped. Just stopped. They are sitting in open space, approximately 40,000 kilometers, inside the corridor, and they are not moving." He paused. "They are also not responding to communication requests from the Conclave duty observer." I picked up my coffee and sat down at the small table by the window. Outside, the stars were where they always were. "What are the Conclave observers saying?" I said. "That the Kreth vessels appear to be fully operational. No distress signals, no visible damage. They are simply not moving." He hesitated. "And there are reports of targeting locks." "What kind?" "The kind that come from things that should not be able to generate targeting locks," he said carefully. "Automated cargo platforms, atmospheric monitoring stations, the University Telescope Array." He stopped. "Ambassador, the Kepler-22 colony's weather satellite network is apparently producing targeting lock signatures that the Kreth fleet's sensors cannot account for." I sipped my coffee. "Sir," Owen said, and his voice was very careful now, the voice of a young man trying to understand something that his training had not quite prepared him for. "Should I be concerned?" "No," I said. "You should finish your breakfast." He looked at me for a moment, and then something in my expression settled him. He nodded and went out. I finished my coffee, and then went to the Conclave observation suite, which was already crowded. The observation suite was a tiered room with a large central display showing a live tactical feed from the Kepler-22 corridor. Delegates from 8 species were already there, clustered in small groups, speaking in low voices. The Kreth representative, Vorath, was standing at the far side of the room with his arms folded, watching the display with an expression I could not read from across the room, but I noticed his posture. His posture was tight, in a way that it had not been at the reception 2 nights ago. Thessaly was near the central display. She saw me come in and moved to my side. "Jump drives," she said quietly, without preamble. "The entire fleet attempted to engage jump drives 40 minutes ago. All 7 ships simultaneously." "And," I said. "Nothing. The drives engaged and then shut down. Every time." She turned to look at me. "Something is suppressing their jump capability across a radius that our instruments cannot fully measure. The Chedrani technical team says the field is centered on the colony itself." She paused. "The Yulari spent 60 years trying to develop a jump suppression field. They never managed one that worked beyond a few hundred meters." "I know," I said. "Does your species have one that works across 40,000 kilometers?" I watched the display. On the feed, the 7 Kreth ships sat motionless, their running lights blinking slowly in the dark of the approach corridor. They looked, from this distance and on this scale, like 7 candles someone had set down and forgotten. "The Kepler-22 colonists are farmers," I said. "Mostly. Some engineers. A university. 3 hospitals." Thessaly stared at me. "You are not answering my question." "I am giving you context," I said. "A colony of 340,000 people, thinly resourced by conclave standards. No standing warships in the registry. Ambassador. Everything in that system that a human being built," I said, still watching the display, "was built with the understanding that it might, one day, need to do more than its stated function." I let that settle for a moment. The colonists know this. Their grandparents knew this. It is not a secret on Kepler-22. It is simply not something they talk about when conclave observers are visiting. On the display, one of the Kreth ships attempted to move laterally. A moment later, the feed showed a cascade of lock indicators appearing around it like a net drawing tight. The ship returned to its original position. Vorath, across the room, uncrossed and recrossed his arms. "Every human-built object in that system," Thessaly said slowly, as if testing each word before she allowed it, "is armed." "That is an oversimplification," I said, "but it is not inaccurate." She was quiet for a moment. On the display, a conclave observer vessel that had been in the system for routine monitoring was now running a detailed scan of the colony itself. The scan results began populating on a secondary screen to the left of the main display. One of the Chedrani delegates moved toward it, read it for a moment, and then said something quietly to a colleague. The colleague looked at the screen and then at me. I did not react. I already knew what the scan would show. It would show a population of 340,000 people going about their ordinary morning routines. Farmers heading to their fields. Children going to school. The university library opening. The bakery on the main square of the primary settlement beginning its first batch of bread. It would also show that approximately 34% of adult colonists were carrying personal weapons rated for use against armored targets. It would show that 22% of adults held certifications in what the conclave database would struggle to translate, because the closest it would get was the phrase, "advanced threat neutralization," which did not quite capture what those people had learned to do, or how thoroughly they had learned it. It would show 340,000 people who looked like farmers and teachers and engineers, because they were farmers and teachers and engineers, and who had also, over generations and without any particular drama, learned to be something else, simultaneously. Thessaly read the scan results from where she stood. I watched her face. "These are civilians," she said. "Yes," I said. "A third of them are carrying weapons that could penetrate a starship hull. Personal sidearms," I said. "Standard on most colony worlds. It is a long walk between settlements. 22% are trained in..." She trailed off, reading the translation again. "The conclave database says, advanced threat neutralization. It is a certification," I said. "You sit an exam. Most of them took it the same semester they got their agricultural licenses." Thessaly turned to look at me. Her feathers along her collar had risen slightly, which I had learned was a Valorian tell for a very particular kind of surprise, not fear. Something closer to the moment when the size of a thing you are looking at suddenly resolves into focus and turns out to be much larger than the distance had suggested. On your homeworld, she said carefully, are there regions where the law requires every household to maintain a weapon? Several, I said. Is that a military policy? No, I said. It is just how some people prefer to live. In case. In case of what? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the 10,000 years of human history before the stars, about the long record of what people did to each other, and the equally long record of what people survived when other people did it to them, and how those two things together had produced a kind of cultural memory that did not have an off switch. In case, I said simply. On the display, Vorath's fleet remained motionless. A new communication flag appeared on the feed, a closed-channel Kreth transmission that the conclave observers flagged as intercepted. The Chadrani technical delegate, who handled most translation requests at this level, turned away from the secondary screen and walked quickly to the Sorathi senior delegate and said something in a very low voice. The Sorathi delegate, a tall, ancient creature named Yun Vel, who had been present at more significant moments in conclave history than anyone else alive, turned and looked at me across the room. She did not look afraid. She looked the way she always looked, which was attentive and calm, as if history were a river she had been watching for so long that she had come to know its currents by feel. But she looked at me with a particular quality of recognition, the way you look at something you have suspected for a long time and are finally seeing confirmed. I gave her a small nod. She gave me a smaller one back. Thessaly, beside me, had not read the intercepted transmission, but she was watching the room, and she was piecing things together with the speed of someone who was very good at their job. What did the transmission say? She asked. I have not read it officially, I said. But, you know. I was quiet for a moment. On the display, a vessel appeared at the edge of the feed. It had decloaked approximately 200 meters off the port side of the Kreth flagship. It was large, very large, larger than anything in Vorath's fleet by a significant margin. It had no visible weapons. It simply appeared, as if it had been there the whole time, which it almost certainly had, and simply chose this moment to be seen. The room went completely silent. How many of those do you have? Thessaly said, very quietly. I watched the feed. Thessaly, I said, that is exactly the right question. On the display, a single calm human voice opened a channel to the Kreth fleet. The voice belonged to someone I had never met, some duty officer on Kepler 22 who had drawn the morning shift, and who now spoke into the open channel with the particular tone of a person for whom this was, professionally speaking, a Tuesday. You are in the wrong lane, the voice said. Do you need directions? Vorath's fleet did not respond. After 47 seconds, the lead vessel began, very slowly, to turn around. No shots were fired. There were no casualties. The 7 ships moved in silence back the way they had come, out of the corridor, across the outer boundary marker, and away. I finished watching the feed and then I went back to my quarters and ate breakfast. Owen, I noticed, looked considerably more relaxed than he had an hour ago. He did not ask me any more questions. He simply made himself useful and quiet, the way he always did, and I appreciated that. And we sat together in the small kitchen, while the station moved through its slow rotation, and the stars outside the window shifted, degree by degree, the way they always did. Later that morning, I received the intercepted Kreth transmission through official channels, via the Chadrani translation team, via the Conclave Secretary's office, in the proper order and format. It was brief. It was addressed from Vorath to the Kreth Home Fleet Command. It said, in the Kreth manner of saying things, which was direct and without decoration, do not engage the humans. We do not know what we would find. I read it once, folded it, and put it in my desk. Then I thought about Thessaly's original question, which I still had not fully answered. I thought about how to answer it, and how much of the answer was something to be proud of, and how much of it was something more complicated than pride. I did not reach a conclusion that morning. I rarely reached conclusions quickly. It was, I had been told by a great many people over the years, one of my more frustrating qualities. I decided to reach it later, and went to read the next round of conclave correspondence. Unwritten found me that afternoon in the conclave library, which was the one place on the Meridian Ring where most delegates did not go, because most delegates preferred rooms with more people in them. The library was quiet, lit softly, and smelled of the recycled air that all space stations share, which is a smell I have always found oddly comforting. She moved slowly, and with great deliberate care, the way all Sarathi moved, as if each step was a considered decision. She was 411 years old, or approximately that, because Sarathi did not track years the way other species did. She had been at the conclave longer than any other delegate, by a considerable distance. She had been present when humanity first made contact with the galactic community, and had sat in the intake session where we were formally introduced. She told me once that she had found us baffling from the first moment. She sat across from me without preamble, which was her way. "The Kreth fleet has withdrawn fully," she said, "as you are aware." "Yes," I said. "Vorath has filed a complaint with the Conclave Secretary's office. He is claiming the Kepler-22 colony was in violation of the Conclave Arms Transparency Protocol." She settled her long hands in her lap. "This claim will not be successful because the Arms Transparency Protocol only applies to registered warships and your colony has none, but the filing is interesting in itself." "He is embarrassed," I said. "He is rethinking," Unwritten said. "Which is more significant?" She looked at me with her dark, half-lidded eyes. "I have been watching your species for 200 years, Ambassador Morrow. I have a perspective that most delegates do not." "I know," I said. "The others look at what happened this morning, and they believe one of two things," she said. "Either they believe that humans are cautious predators who have been patiently hiding their capabilities, and are now revealing themselves, or they believe that you became very lucky today, and that the situation reflects a cleverly placed trap." She paused. "Both of those interpretations are wrong." I watched her. "What is the correct one?" "Your people are not hiding strength," she said. "You are hiding the fact that what others call strength is, for you, simply the natural condition. You do not maintain it through policy or program. You maintain it because your history never gave you the choice to set it down." She was quiet for a moment. "That is what frightens them, when they begin to understand it. Not the weapons, not the ships, the fact that all of it is effortless, that there is no version of your species that does not come pre-equipped." I thought about that for a while. The library was very quiet. Somewhere in the station, maintenance systems hummed their low, steady hum. "It is not entirely something to be proud of," I said. "What made us this way?" "No," she said. "I did not say it was. We spent 10,000 years afraid of each other," I said. "Not of external threats, of each other. Neighbor afraid of neighbor, nation afraid of nation. That fear is why we are ready. Not wisdom, not strategy, fear." "Yes," she said simply. I looked at the table. "We carried it to the stars with us." "Yes," she said again. "And now you sit in this conclave, and every species here has looked at you for 2 centuries, and felt something they could not name, and what they felt was this. They have been afraid of things we have never been afraid of, and that terrifies us." She tilted her head. "Your peace, Ambassador, is the peace of something that has already learned to live with the worst. That is a very different thing from the peace of something that has never experienced it." I was quiet for a long moment. "Is there going to be a coalition?" I said. The word had been moving through conclave corridors for the past few hours. 3 smaller factions had apparently begun discussing a formal resolution to review all species' military capabilities. Everyone knew what it actually meant. Everyone knew who it was aimed at. "There will be an attempt," Unwritten said. "Whether it succeeds depends on how the next session is handled." She looked at me steadily. "Your government has been in contact with you." It was not a question. I answered it anyway. "They want the coalition stopped," I said. "Not because they are concerned about the outcome, because the moment you force a formal demonstration, the mystery is gone, and the mystery is the whole point." She nodded once, slowly, the way she always nodded when she had already anticipated something and was confirming it. "The question every species is really asking," she said, "is not what you can do. It is whether you could be provoked into doing it, whether there is a line, whether you lose control." She paused. "Vorath believed there was a line, and he believed he understood where it was. He was wrong about the line. He was right that there is one, I said. Yes, but he could not find it. And that, she said, standing slowly, with the careful movement of someone who had lived long enough to move carefully, is exactly what they need to keep believing. She left the library without another word. I sat for a while in the quiet, with the recycled air and the soft light, and I thought about what she had said. I thought about home, about a planet that had produced both symphonies and terrible weapons, sometimes in the same century, sometimes in the same city, sometimes by the same people. About a species that had never entirely been at peace with itself, and had gone to the stars carrying that fact like a stone in its pocket, heavy and constant, and so familiar that most of us had stopped noticing the weight. I thought about the 340,000 people on Kepler 22 who had woken up this morning and gone about their lives and had, somewhere in the background of those ordinary lives, without drama or announcement, helped stop a fleet from crossing a line. Farmers, teachers, engineers, and other things simultaneously. I thought about Thessaly's question, which I still had not finished answering. I thought about what the full answer was going to cost, to say out loud, in the conclave chamber, to a room full of species who were trying to decide what to do with the fact of us. Then I got up, put the thoughts away for the moment, and went to prepare for the next session. The corridor outside the library was busy. Delegates passed in small groups, speaking in the tight, rapid way that meant information was moving. I caught fragments as I walked. The word coalition, the word review, the word humans, repeated in several different languages, with several different inflections. Some of them were curious, some were something else. Owen fell into step beside me as I turned toward the delegation wing. The coalition resolution has been formally submitted, he said quietly. 3 sponsors. 9 co-signatories so far. Who are the co-signatories? I said. He told me. I listened without reacting. 2 of the names surprised me slightly. The rest did not. Has the scheduling office placed it on the agenda for the full session tomorrow? Yes, sir. I walked for a moment in silence. The station continued its slow rotation around us. The stars outside the corridor windows shifted a few degrees. Owen? I said. Sir, get some sleep tonight. Tomorrow is going to be a long day. He nodded and veered off toward his own quarters. I continued down the corridor, past other delegates who watched me with various expressions, past the observation windows and the endless stars, toward my own door and the quiet room beyond it. I sat at my desk for a while. I did not read correspondence. I did not review the coalition resolution. I thought about what I was going to say tomorrow, and how to say it, and whether saying it clearly enough to be persuasive would mean saying it in a way that gave too much away. There was a version of tomorrow that went well, and a version that did not. In the version that did not go well, humanity would be required to demonstrate something in front of the entire conclave, and the mystery that had kept the peace for 200 years would be gone, and everything after that would be different in ways that were difficult to predict but easy to worry about. In the version that went well, I would have to stand in that chamber and tell the truth about my species, openly and completely, in a way that I had never done before. I was not sure which version I was more prepared for. I made myself a cup of tea, which I did not drink, and went to bed. I lay in the dark and listened to the hum of the station, and I thought, as I often did in quiet moments, about all the humans who had ever stood in a hard place and found that they were more ready than they had expected to be. That was also part of the inheritance. Not just the weapons and the training and the quiet systems and the long memory. The readiness itself, the capacity to be in a difficult moment and not break, was something that had been built over centuries of difficult moments, and it was in us whether we were thinking about it or not. I thought, tomorrow I will stand up and I will say what needs to be said. And then I went to sleep. The coalition resolution was listed 4th on the formal agenda for the morning session. I arrived early and sat in the human delegation seat and watched the chamber fill. Vorath was present, which I had not been certain he would be, seated in the Kreth observer position with the same careful, tight posture I had noticed 2 days ago. Thessaly was in the Valorian seat, and when I caught her eye, she gave me a look that I could not fully interpret, but that felt like someone steadying themselves before something important. Ewan Vel was in the Sarathi seat, which was at the front of the chamber, near the center, because the Sarathi were the oldest continuous member of the conclave, and seniority determined placement. She looked the way she always looked, calm, attentive, very old. The session moved through the first 3 agenda items with a speed that suggested nobody was interested in those items. Then the moderator announced the coalition resolution, and the chamber went very still, the way a room goes still when everyone in it has been waiting for a particular moment and it has arrived. The lead sponsor, a Chedrani delegate named Vessel 7, read the resolution aloud. It was politely worded. It called for a mutual capability review of all conclave member species, to be conducted in the spirit of transparency and collective security. It noted that recent events had raised questions that the existing framework had not been designed to address. It did not mention humans by name. It did not need to. When Vessel 7 finished reading, the moderator opened the floor for response. I stood up. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. It was the silence of 212 years of a question that had never been answered out loud, finally being given its moment. I looked around the chamber. I did not use prepared notes. I had written some, the previous night, and then set them aside, because the prepared version of what I wanted to say was not the right version. I would like, I said, to answer a question that was asked of me 3 days ago, at a reception on this station, by a colleague I have come to respect. Thessaly, in the Valorian seat, was very still. The question was simple, I said. Why has no species in this conclave ever seriously moved against humanity? Not in 200 years. Not once. I paused. I have been thinking about how to answer it, and I have decided the most useful thing I can do is simply tell the truth. The chamber was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system. Humanity is not hiding, I said. We are not concealing a secret military capability that we have been planning to reveal at a strategic moment. We have no grand design. What we have is something considerably harder to explain, which is a people shaped by 10,000 years of difficulty. I paused. Every other species in this chamber reached a point in its development where things became, broadly speaking, safe, where the external threat receded or was resolved, where cooperation became the obvious and dominant mode, and that is good. That is the right way for things to go. I let that sit for a moment. Humans had a different experience, I said. The difficulty did not come from outside. It came from within, from us, from our own choices and our own conflicts and the long, expensive, terrible record of what we were capable of doing to each other. We never had a moment where the threat resolved, because we were the threat, and so we never stopped preparing, because what we were preparing for was not some external enemy. It was the simple possibility that tomorrow might be as hard as yesterday. I looked at Vessel 7. The capability you are trying to review, I said, does not exist separately from us. It is not a program. It is not a fleet or a technology. It is 340,000 farmers on Kepler 22 who learned, as their parents learned, as their grandparents learned, that the world requires them to be ready, and who built that readiness into their daily lives without any particular drama, the same way they built their homes and planted their fields. I looked at Vorath. It is the fact that the most dangerous thing about my species is not any specific weapon or any specific ship. It is that we do not have an off switch. We do not reach a point of sufficient safety and relax. We have never found that point. Perhaps we never will. I looked at Unwritten. And it is the fact that we know this about ourselves. We have known it for a long time. It is part of why the Quiet Accord was made, 40 years after first contact. Not because we wanted to deceive anyone, because we understood, from our own history, that a threat which cannot be measured, cannot be calibrated against, and a species that is impossible to calibrate against, is not a species that any sensible actor wants to provoke. I looked back at the center of the chamber. The coalition resolution asks for a review in the spirit of transparency, I said. I am going to be transparent. Humanity has prepared for the possibility of conflict since before we had the word for it. We are still preparing. We will continue to prepare. Not because we want war. We want it less than any species in this room, because we have more experience of what it costs. I paused. But we have never been a people that stopped being ready. And the honest answer to why no one has moved against us in 200 years is not that we are hiding something. It is that everyone who looked closely enough saw a species that would simply never stop. The chamber was very quiet. I would ask the coalition sponsors, I said, to consider what a formal capability review would actually produce. It would produce a number, a specific, documented, formally recorded number. And that number, whatever it is, would be the thing every potential aggressor in this galaxy would spend the next century trying to plan around. I let that sit. Right now, there is no number. There is only uncertainty. And uncertainty, as I believe this chamber understands, is the most effective deterrent that has ever existed. I sat down. The room did not burst into noise. It stayed quiet for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then it slowly, cautiously, began to fill with sound. The vote, when it came, was close. Closer than I had hoped. Closer than Unwritten had predicted, though she told me afterward that she had predicted it would be close, and had simply not wished to add to my preparation burden. The coalition resolution failed by 7 votes. Unwriten's Sarathi bloc voted against it, all of them, in the silent, unified way the Sarathi always voted. 3 other species voted against it for reasons I understood to be essentially practical. They did not want to find out what the number was either. Afterward, as the chamber emptied, Vorath walked past me without stopping. He did not look at me, but he slowed, just slightly, for a fraction of a second, and I understood that as the closest thing to an acknowledgement he was going to offer. I stood and collected my things and walked out of the chamber. Thessaly was waiting in the corridor. She looked different than she had 3 days ago at the reception. She had the look of someone who had gone into a situation expecting one thing and come out the other side carrying something heavier and more complex. Not unhappy, but carrying more than before. "I have been thinking," she said, "about everything you have told me since the reception." "I know," I said. "I think I was asking the wrong question from the beginning," she said. "I asked why no one attacks you. But the real question is what happens inside your species when someone does. Not to them, what happens to you?" I looked at her for a moment. "We win," I said. "Yes, I understand that now." She was quiet for a moment. "But who are you after?" I did not answer immediately. It was, I thought, the most honest question anyone had asked me in a very long time. It was the question I had been sitting with since the previous night, in my quiet quarters, in the dark. "That," I said finally, "is something we think about." She held my gaze. "Good," she said. "I am glad you think about it." We stood in the corridor for a moment, the station humming around us, the other delegates moving past in their groups, the ordinary traffic of a diplomatic station on an ordinary morning that had not, in the end, turned into anything catastrophic. "If something came," Thessaly said then, quietly, as if she were thinking out loud rather than speaking to me. "Something from the outer reaches, something none of us had seen before, and none of us understood, and all of us were afraid." "Yes," I said. "I would want to be standing next to a human," she said. I thought about that. I thought about everything it assumed, and everything it understood, and everything it still had not quite grasped. "That," I said, "is exactly the right answer." She nodded once, and then she walked back toward the Valorian delegation suite, her feathers settling along her collar in the way that meant she had made her peace with something. I walked the other way, back along the corridor toward the observation ring, past the delegates who glanced at me with new eyes, past the windows where the stars held their infinite positions, past all the small, ordinary details of a station that was home to no one and stopover for everyone. I stopped at one of the observation windows and looked out. Out there, somewhere, the Kreth fleet was heading home. Vorath was writing his report, and his report was going to say things that would be read by people who would read them very carefully and come to very careful conclusions, and those conclusions would shape what happened next between our species and his, and I did not know exactly what they would be, but I knew they would include that particular caution, that particular reluctance to test the edges of something you could not measure. Out there, on Kepler 22, 340,000 people were finishing their day. The farmers were coming in from the fields. The children were coming home from school. The library was still open. The bakery on the main square had, presumably, sold everything it made that morning and was getting ready to make more. They had not been told, most of them, that a fleet had come and gone. They had simply lived their day, and somewhere in the background of that day, in the systems that ran quietly beneath everything, the same readiness that had always been there had done what it was built to do, and then returned to its quiet waiting. They were not soldiers. They were farmers and teachers and engineers and parents and students and bakers. They were also other things, because they came from a place and a people that had learned, long before the stars, that those two facts did not have to be in conflict. I thought about Yunvel's words. Your peace is the peace of something that has already learned to live with the worst. I thought about whether that was something to grieve or something to carry with a steady hand. I thought, both. It is both. And that, I decided, was the most honest answer I had found in 3 days of answering questions. I was still there at the window when Owen came to find me for the afternoon session. "Ready, sir," he said. "Yes," I said, and turned away from the stars and went back to work. We were humans. We had been ready for a very long time. Long before anyone out here had thought to ask us why. Long before the stars had names we recognized. Long before any of this. We had been ready since before we knew what we were getting ready for. We still were. And we always would be.